One.
How is that a test?
Hello, can you hear me? Great. One moment. Okay. Debt trap is a disease, and we think it's unfair that you need to be sick twice. We think that once you get a bailout, it's enough, and it's enough to be debt trapped once by China, and we don't believe that it should be fair that you should be sick twice. We will explain to you specifically why we prevent that, and we'll explain to you why we cause better growth for these countries after the bailout. A couple of points of framing. So we think that the most bailouts happen in developing countries in most of these cases that we're talking about. We think that the bailout happens for a couple of reasons, and many times the huge debt from China is a huge part of it, which we'll explain. Many times, yes, climate, military stability, and corruption. We think that once we do this thing and we give a bailout to a country, it can take any infrastructure also built by China in its country to be part of it. It doesn't need to pay China for it or anything else, so it's part of it and can use it, and China cannot expropriate or anything else. Firstly, we think that let's characterize how the bailout is taken. So we think that the IMF is not alone today. Yes, we consider there is also some competitiveness from China already for a competitive IMF. We think that in most cases people prefer the IMF that is today because it has much more money, it is more efficient, and most importantly, it does not debt trap. It gives you clear terms that actually don't take huge amounts of money from you. In that, we think that most countries will continue to do this. But even if most countries prefer the Chinese IMF, they just don't have much money to bail out a lot of countries. Yes, we think that China is under a huge, this is an important framing, that China is under huge economic stress right now. We think that China is under a huge housing crisis that happens today. They need a huge military development, which is their priority in terms of Taiwan, and much less to economy. That means that they also don't have the money for that, and moreover, that means that they need their debt right now, and they want it, and they won't actually let anyone else, will cancel it. How will China react? We don't think it will react militarily in any way. We don't think that it has the power to do that. We don't think it has military bases abroad other than Djibouti, and it's, I'm sorry, just symbolic there. Now, moreover, we think that they can't react very much strongly because we think that they depend hugely on their production sector. They still need people to actually buy their stuff. Specifically, they are in huge competition with other places in Southeast Asia, specifically for textile, for electronics, from India specifically. So they need as much. Already they are suffering because of the US not buying from them because of tariffs. They need as much buying, so we don't think that it's likely they will do tariffs. And even if they do, we still think that it is worth it for the country to actually bail itself out. Lastly, why we need to force these countries to it? We think that because of short-term things that the countries think many times, because there is no legitimacy to cancel debt or just make or pause it on your own, because they fear backlash from China without the backs of the IMF before them, and lastly, because of corruption and other problems that are unfortunately very there in developing countries. Okay. Why is Chinese debt trap so bad, and how does it specifically work? We think that there is not many times Chinese specifically go to corrupt governments or governments that rely on short-term and need to be elected very often and are unstable, and offer them a sweetheart deal. We offer you a huge port or a huge railway. You can tell your voters that it will be there. Just sign there and there. Many times they specifically go to the prime ministers and prevent any professionals going through it, specifically making many times the debt with huge asterisks and things that make it very big in the long term. We think that we've seen that in so many places, but just in order to understand even still why it's likely for them to happen, they have a huge incentive to get as much money back in these cases. Many times the infrastructure itself just doesn't pay off, and this is the most important thing. They tell the country, look, in 5 years the port will pay off, we just take 1 million of taxes. But the thing is, in most cases it doesn't pay off in that time, because it's an optimistic view, because they have the interest to lie to these countries in these cases. This means that there are huge debts that are accumulating. Just to understand, this means that yes, they got maybe $1,000, but they need to return after interest and inflation, all of these things, $2,000 accumulating in the next 10, and if it's 20 years, it becomes $3,000 or even more. This is crucial because it means that it means small countries with huge infrastructure, other things like BRI, this means that we harm, and 40 or 50% of taxes many times go into debt. What is the huge impact that we are actually causing? Firstly, by pausing the debt, we can actually bail themselves out. The amount of money the IMF needs to actually give in order to bail out is much less when they don't need to give almost half of it to things like going to China. Notice we already analyzed why China is unlikely to pause debt, specifically because it's economically fraught state. This is crucial because it means that the ability to bail out is much better on our side and much faster. What does this mean? That the country is able to actually incentivize people to go to jobs or retraining because they don't need to pay the debt in other things. That means that they control the port and can control that all companies can go in, and not only Chinese company, which many times they are bound to do, because many times through debt trap, China says, okay, if you didn't pay the debt, I will just take the port. We prevent these things and thus actually enable to control trade much better in these countries. So we just notice now the IMF needs to give less money per state, which means that we can bail out more countries. Before I move, and this is crucial in offices, before I move on, second, yes.
Maybe this very reductive analysis of the BRI was true 10 years ago, but obviously China has been reactive to the pressures that you yourself are talking about. Why?
10 years ago, and now it's fucking them up. You actually conceded to what we told you, yes? This is actually how debt works. You take the debt at one time, and you can no longer return it in that way. Yes, we think that China has fucked itself by making a bad name for itself in debt. But it's too late, and they need the money, and they don't have any incentive to return it. And moreover, if they just cancel debt in all of these things, then they would cancel it before the bailout. Notice, the incentive to cancel debt is better on our side of the house because they have incentive still to trade with this country, not only to trade, to give loans. So we flip what you actually claim to us. Lastly, we think that you're a country that now is just under siege and things. Many times we think that on their side, bailouts by the IMF happen. But then, and specifically then, China has more incentive to tell them, look, you should take out a loan. Why? Specifically when a country is in a risky situation, this is where you get the most interest rates. This is where you can tell them, look, I need unfortunately 10% interest rates because of that. We think that because most of these governments look in the short term, because most of these governments are pressured many times through gifts and through corruption also by the Chinese, this happens, and that means that this is harm that can cause a crisis again. This is not the same on the Western side. We think that the US understands that its prestige is specifically not on being a loan shark. Big banks that actually loan only if it's stable, but moreover, they understand, Morgan Stanley, etc., that they will be fucked by the SEC in general if they do things like that. So, only on your side is there a huge harm to debt and huge short-term and long-term harm to the countries. On our side, more bailouts, more help to the countries. I call you to and proudly propose.
Good. Okay. Sorry, the mic works, so I should stand. If I stand here, do people not hear me, and then it works here? That's kind of crazy. Is that true?
The mic is only for the live stream.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. Let's let the viewers at home listen to the case then. All right. What role does the IMF play in the global economy? It's the lender of last resort. That means that when you invest in a country that is in a debt crisis, you are reassured that it will be able to pay off your debt from other sources, that the economy is not going to go to shit because the IMF is going to be there to give you a last line of credit. It does this by purchasing previous debt at a substantial discount and by giving countries cash directly that they can then use to economically recover. What happens now? The IMF says the IMF has to get paid first, and countries in crisis have no choice in the matter. I think there are two implications of this into the IMF's role as a last resort. The first one is that China itself is likely to pull out of investing both in the IMF and in other countries. And secondly, it sets a dangerous precedent that further decreases global investment. I want to start with a simple piece of argumentation that I think instantly damns opening government, which is that the IMF's largest funder at the moment is China. The single country that contributes the largest amount of money to the IMF is China. And the consequence of, and the reason why this is true is because they require global economic stability just like any other country does. These aren't evil bastards. They also want to be able to sell in other markets. They also want to be able to not have countries in debt crises that causes instability that harms them as well. But secondly, because China is a major creditor through foreign direct investment, like not through the IMF, it benefits from the IMF's role as a last resort through its own creditor status as well. Rumin, look me in the eye. I know this. Secondly, China makes significant investments and payments separately, and these investments and payments also get screwed over. Why do they make these payments? They make them through governments, they make them through state-owned enterprises. They say the BRI goes down, sure, but just to be clear, it went down from something that we used to talk about debating all the time as this event of incredible global prominence and unprecedented level of investment to lower than that, which is still a large amount of investment, right? But moreover, I would posit that this decline is often temporary. It was due to the overheating of the Chinese economy due to things like Evergrande and COVID lockdowns in Shanghai. The best bet, I think, in the long term is that one of the world's largest economies is going to continue to become a major investor in other economies in that world. I think that's the basic premise that is quite simple to accept. What happens then? China is going to pull out of the IMF for the simple reason that the IMF has literally put them on a blacklist. I think it's incredibly unclear why they would require to stay there when you've pissed them off to the extent that you've said not like some general policy, but specifically China, those lenders can't be paid back. I think that's what means that they're likely to pull out of this funding, which is crucial because insofar as they like the IMF, I think when you decrease the IMF's capacity to make those loans, that's greatly harmful. It means that countries get fewer loans. It means that countries and the IMF has to wait longer when the countries become more and more desperate in order to make those loans in the first place. But secondly, you just get far less FDI from China to the developing world because now a lot of these countries that are in debt crises can't accept loans from China by the direct like fiat of the info slide, but also because in any case that a country might in the future get into debt crisis, China is unlikely to preemptively decide to invest in them because they know that if an IMF bailout is necessary, then they will not get paid back. I think the debate response here, the debate-brained argument, is, well, the BRI is bad because in Sri Lanka, they seized the Hambantota ports. The weighing here is I think the ownership of infrastructure is secondary. I don't care who gets a little profit whenever I go over the bridge. I care that the bridge was built in the first place such that that infrastructure was able to carry through. Because most of the surplus that comes from infrastructural investments don't go to the person who owns the infrastructure. It goes to the people who use it every day, who positive externalities flow through that economy. Opening government says we should take the money and run. There are two problems with this approach. The first one was why forcing was necessary to happen. They say China will pressure them otherwise. What the fuck? Let's be very clear here. China's pressure exists on either side of the house. The difference is that you add an extra layer of coercion at the point at which you do not give developing countries the agency to decide whether they do want China as a creditor into the future, whether they do want to pay China back eventually. But the second problem with taking the money and running is you can only ever get some free infrastructure once, because the second time that you want to do this and you want to get recurring investment from China, it obviously cannot work any further because China will wake up to the fact that you are doing this. I want to secondly talk about precedent and why this affects not only China as a creditor, but the global creditor market as a whole. But first, I'll take closing. No, okay, I'll take you later, maybe. Actually, now you can just POID on when you come up with something better. All right. Precedent. I think this signals a massive shift in the IMF as a cooperative movement where you got China and the United States and a bunch of developing countries to the table at the same time to an adversarial movement that is used for political reasons that is not aligned with the global interest. And this is a strong and loud signal. Why is it a loud signal? Because this is a huge global event. This is something that every investor will see on their Bloomberg terminals and will dominate the news cycles for many times. And because China is the biggest funder. This isn't like some peripheral nation that's been shut off for some random reasons. This is literally China we're talking about. It's unprecedented in scale. And I would note here that whatever justification the IMF comes up with as to why we don't need to pay Chinese debtors back will obviously apply to many other creditor nations as well. It'll apply to the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East that do investments. It will apply to other investments, for example, like American investors who often do also do some of this seizing stuff, or like generally speaking do some sketchy practices. Again, I think what matters is that it's built in the first place, not who ends up owning it. But finally, and this is the final structural reason here, here is that the developing world has gotten much more like votes in the IMF recently. There's just like more like empowerment of the developing world in there. And what that means is the West no longer dominates the IMF as an institution. It's no longer clear that 20 years down the line, the West is not going to be blacklisted as well over issues over issues that do split countries up together, like Israel and Palestine, causing global rifts in geopolitics. The consequence of all of this is that other investors are also going to be scared off. If the IMF is going to demand that they get paid back first, that you can't take any new loans from these creditors, that any loans they already have gone to shit, I think that means that the IMF moves from a reassuring mechanism that means that you do want to invest in other countries to a mechanism that actively unassures you against making those investments. Because now you don't have the reassurances you previously had. What was that reassurance? It was the fact that it was in the developing countries' interest often to pay you back, which is why they wanted to pay you back in the first place. Because when they paid you back, they could get future debt going forward, and meant that they were able to get it for lower interest rates. It meant that they were able to continue revitalizing their economy. And I would note in the cases where it wasn't in their interest to pay you back, they could default. That's why debt doesn't sell at $1 for $1, right? That's why debt comes at a discount, is because there's an inherent amount of risk that debt might not get paid back. So they can choose not to pay you back. It's not like the Chinese are going to bring the military in and invade a country that hasn't paid them back. This is not how international debt lending works. And the consequence of this is quite simply that you restrict the agency of these countries. I think quite simply the most important thing in this debate is economic recovery. IMF debtor nations are in debt crises, and the most severe harms accrue as a consequence of this. We have to preserve the lender of last resort. They flipped the IMF from being a benefit to the global loan market and investment market to an active threat. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for a very fine speech. I'd like to yield the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister for this debate. Here, here.
May I? So apparently having eyes is some sort of equivalent to analysis right now. So look at me, Paned. I also have blue eyes. Maybe it's some extra point for analysis, right? Notice, Boaz says at the framing of his speech, 7 different reasons why China just doesn't have the money to help those states right now. They have different interests. They have difficult things to deal with internally in China. We get zero response to that in the speech we just heard. They say China will pull out. You know what? That's a good thing if they don't have the money to help specifically the causes that they want, and just make other Western states be afraid to enter those specific things. Exactly. I'm going to be very simple in my speech. I'm going to take line by line, the entire case given to us by OG to make sure that you guys know that they are just bluntly lying to you. Then I'm going to do 2 main things. I'm going to explain why we actually make the stability of the IMF a lot stronger, specifically why we think that there's a lot of accountability to the IMF, which we don't have to the equivalent on the Chinese IMF, and then I'm going to explain why preventing crises and taking those states out of it is the most important thing in this debate. Let's go. Open in opposition. What do we hear? The first thing that we hear is China is the messy investor of the IMF. You know who else was surprised by that case? CO, because that is just a lie. China doesn't invest in the IMF for the past 7 years, even more, I don't know, but it just doesn't happen, right? Notice, Boaz already explained that there's an equivalent IMF, which is Chinese, which now they tend to use over the IMF. You know what else tells you that is a lie? The IMF, in debate, we usually do that as the Western money. You know who else thinks that it's Western money, the IMF? Chinese, because most of the states that actually have their money and funds in the IMF are Western countries that do not want to cooperate with China over giving loans, specifically after their loan, what happened after the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't know, 10 years ago, like Marta said, although it wasn't 10 years ago, but who cares? And notice, and this is crucial, they have just no interest to keep on putting money under the IMF. Because China is in their own troubles right now financially, they want to make investments that can actually give them money right away. That is kind of weird to claim that the IMF is going to return the money to China kind of fast. And they need that money. They don't have extra money in order to invest it in the IMF and hopefully get it in 10 or 15 years. Therefore, they have no interest in doing that, although even in reality it's a lie, so it's kind of weird to even do that. Then they say, look, we don't care about any things for more extra money, we care about the infrastructure that is being built. This is exactly what we get more under ourselves, the house. Because China doesn't do it right now, we think that what we need is to have an alternatives for the things that are being put out. The alternatives are Western countries that have the funds to do that and have the incentives. For example, the US that needs a lot of factories and are now afraid of entering those African states because China is controlling there. A lot of Chinese constructors and things are still there because of the initiative that was 10 years ago. They're afraid of building their factories there. They're afraid of actually intertwining with China and being like assumed of collaborating with China. Therefore, a lot of Western states, even in Europe, doesn't want to put their factories and put their funds there. Once China is going to pull out, this is exactly where we get more factories, more bridges, and more taking care, therefore flipping the case from OO. Last thing that they say is about presidents. And notice, I'm a lawyer, but that is a weird case. Like, I don't know, if the IMF will think that it's also a good thing to do it for other, I don't know, countries, then yeah, if it's the same analogy, maybe we should do that. I don't think that it's the same. If not, they're going to be smart enough to figure that out. They will have more than 15 minutes of prep than OO. Let's talk about why we get better stability for the IMF, right? Because notice that today we have a lot of countries that has debt to China, which are kind of, it's hard for them to take it back. Why is it crucial? Because notice that once the IMF, wait just a second. Okay, but once the IMF giving that money today under the status quo, they have no control on what those states are going to do. Meaning the states can keep on taking those debts, can keep on making those loans even bigger. Why is it crucial? Because like OO themselves claim, the IMF doesn't have an endless amount of money. And if they're not going to see money being returned, their ability to keep on helping other states is going to go smaller and smaller. Notice, if I have $100 and I give $70 to it because I want to buy the loan from a different country, it means I have only $30 now. If I want to invest the $30, it means I'm going to left with zero. I'm going to trust those countries to return that money. But if they're not going to be able because they prioritize putting it back to China because they're afraid of not doing that, or because they want to take on other loans because they think it's better for them, it means that the IMF is not going to see in many of those cases that money back. This is crucial, panel, because it means that less states that actually need those bridges and factories and all of the things that OO wants are not going to have that. Second of all, notice that also states that had the ability to rehabilitate doesn't have them because their government doesn't use those monies and funds wisely, and therefore we get a lot less of the benefits, which means that a lot of states are not going to have the most basic needs for the citizens. But second of all, notice that we just think that a lot of states that could have gotten closer to the West and actually use those funds in order to have other investors and other things coming in are not going to get that. Before I continue, yes?
Except the IMF already imposes many other criteria to make sure that states repay, like mandatory fiscal policy and transparency. Why are those things not sufficient?
Because you can do all of those things and still get into more loans and more debts and actually make the situation worse. It's not a binary thing, right? Even if the situation is okay, we can make it better, and you should support with more bridges like OO wants. This is not a dichotomy like Marta wants to put it. Why now we think that it's going to be easier for states to go out of crisis? Because notice a couple of things, as Boaz already says, and get no answer. Boaz explains to you exactly why those states have the interest to take both of the loans and not returning them that easily. Boaz already explains to you exactly why this is the only ability to actually do that. Why is this the most important thing in this debate? Because notice, when the loan is getting bigger and bigger, we have a bigger inflation that doesn't allow to actually doing it back. Notice, a lot of those states doesn't have central banks that can just fix them, right? Marta wants you to believe that when they say monetary or fiscal or other things of EPL, then all of a sudden magic solution and things are perfect. Most of them doesn't have central banks that can actually apply that easily, and it takes them years in order to actually get to the terms that they agreed to, and actually takes them years in order to get the loan that they wanted to do. Now we say it's going to be a lot more easier because we trust you more. Notice, it means that a lot more people that just need basic things that we can lower the inflation for, like water, like food, like place to live, are going to get it. A lot more of the neighboring states that are now afraid to trade with them because they know that their loans are just getting bigger are going to trust them more and therefore trading more, and therefore even neighboring state is going to be bigger. On our side of the house, we actually allow people to get less inflation, to have more money, and to have more life. This is the most important thing to support in this debate.
Speaking to the live stream, you might want to turn down the volume. contrary to popular belief in the Gov bench, most countries don't want other countries to go to shit. I'm slowly warming up to the European circuit, so I'll give you two structural reasons. The first is self-interest, because stability of the global market means growth. Stability also means less of a contagion effect. Now we have a global ecosystem where everybody's investments are connected. Instability that leads to contagion hurts you as well. Second, uncertainty is bad. You can predict things that are more certain. If you don't know what's going to go on in the 5 years or 10 years from now, it's going to hurt your ability to plan economic policy today as well. So even if you don't believe the factual claim that China loans the most amount of money to the IMF, you should believe the structural reasons claim that you all seem to love as to why it actually does happen. And it is true. The bar for intransigence, therefore, is high. It is especially high when the country is tied. China is tied to your global ecosystem of maintaining stability. They said, but surely they do it through the Asian Development Bank instead. No, they do it through both. They do it through different lenders working together to ensure that a country is able to stay solvent. The thesis of OO is that China does not clear the bar for you to determine that it is intransient. Ironically, I'm going to bail OG out because I acknowledge that this new piece of information about the world was a shocking fact for them, and therefore maybe they have no good responses. The best argument against our case, actually, and what I'll give you for free, is that the West combined pays more than China. They have more direct control of the IMF, and maybe that's good for the world. I have three responses. One, the West now carries more risk if the IMF is not paid back. I.e., if a country collapses despite a bailout, now the West is the one that has significantly more risk because you can't diffuse some of that risk to China through the IMF. So they will be more afraid of lending money to the IMF as well. Second, post-2008, the West actually had less direct control over the IMF because one, they found that conditionalities were bad because of the Asian financial crisis, which I went through, but second, because countries like Brazil, India, for example, also became significant creditors to the IMF, so you couldn't impose the same degree of conditionalities that you could otherwise have imposed in the 1990s. Third, you cannot service this debt without China. You just need more money. If China pulls out right now, there's a massive exogenous shock to how much money there is in the IMF. And what we're telling you is that the fact that you're going to do it right now means that there's going to be this big amount of money that's going to be pulled out. Even if they can recover, the West can, like, in the long term, fill up this gap again. In the immediate short term, it's going to lead to a significant crash to the IMF's ability to help countries service their debt. That is why OG is definitely out of this round. What did they say? They say China is poor. China, no money. The world's second largest economy, bolui. Sorry, bolui means no money in Hokkien. But the first thing I'll point out here is that that's obviously not true. Right? They have a significant manufacturing market. We all know this already. But second, if it is true that they are poor, I suggest to you that's why they want to loan more to the IMF. Because an unstable global economy will hurt them more when demand for their products goes down, right? So first of all, that's very intuitive. But second, their claim is, no. We trap the countries in debt, and then as a result of this, now we got more money. How the fuck does that work? Debt is often paid in the long term, right? It's paid 10 years, 20 years down the line. So if they want more money today, they wouldn't want to be trapping countries in debt and giving their own money over to Africa for the next 20 years, right? If you think about it, that's why African debt restructuring negotiations right now is about paying the money back across the long term, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, not right now. So even if China is poor, they have more incentive to help these countries than to hurt them. They then say, there's an interest to lie, right? They fucked them over in the 2015, 2016 already, but first of all, it is not a product of malice, but of circumstance. Look, China couldn't predict COVID. None of us could predict COVID, which is why BRI looked like a really good idea in 2018, but doesn't look like such a good idea today. The reality is China's still recovering from this as well. We acknowledge that, but the difference here is they are not trying to hurt countries in this way. They do want the debt paid off, obviously, as any country did, but the reason why they lent out all this money in the first place was to boost their own economic infrastructure. They probably deserve that money back, given that they actually, help Africa build bridges and build roads and build ports. Third, they say, but ownership, the port go to from Sri Lanka go to China, that's why it's bad. I think Tenet comprehensively takes this down when he tells you that the main consumer surplus that comes as a result of there being a port is significantly higher than the small amount of profit that comes from transferring ownership in the first place. If that is the price we have to pay, goddamn, I'm willing to pay that price. Okay, CG, come on. Come on, I'm trying to engage, bro. Come on.
Yeah, so if you really think that this is so dangerous, then why wouldn't China just change their incentives?
But because China is gonna be fucking pissed off that the IMF did this weird thing to them that they didn't have to do, right? Like you are destabilizing the global economy for no benefit whatsoever. So what does Tenet tell you next? Tenet tells you that the IMF is a lender of last resort. And I'm gonna just do a very intuitive push here. Why do you need a bailout? The reason is because you took on debt, somebody else's debt, and therefore now you no money, right? So you go to the lender of last resort and you say, I need money. And the lender says, can, but you must pay me first. Like think about it, right? That cannot be how the economy works. Insofar as the fact that you are borrowing money in the first place is to pay off somebody else's debt, it is unclear how the system will work on their side of the house. But second, it does set a terrible precedence. And that precedence is that even a country the size of China, even a country with a significant investment in the IMF that China has, can be screwed over by the IMF at any point, any whim and fancy. So maybe the West will feel happy about this, but you know who wouldn't? Brazil wouldn't. India wouldn't. All sorts of other countries that are not Western liberal economies probably wouldn't. And that's when the IMF stops working, insofar as these countries fear this will happen to them as well. That is why we need the global economy to work in tandem. In the aftermath of 2008, we saw the consequence of the global economy going in different directions, right? And that's why things like the Basel agreements, things like global conferences came together to set up things that will ensure that the economy work together in tandem. The last missing link of our case that I'll fill up now is maybe you believe now that the IMF is the lender of last resort, but you don't believe that it should be. Here's why it should be. One, because it's the largest diffuser of risk. If every country is contributing, risk is diffused the most. Second, it's the only lender where all countries can vote, which is why it's better than the fact they cannot vote on CCP policy or commercial banks. And third, it is the only current place where global cooperation right now happens. That's why it should be the lender of last resort. That's why only OO can win this debate.
How's the mic doing? Okay, maybe bring it closer up, I guess. All right, nice. What opening government missed was that the snake learned a few new tricks. They might have stopped giving debt trap diplomacy. That's something that I think most people who read newspapers know. But they still have many realistic problems. We're firstly going to show you how those are solved by only taking IMF loans, and secondly, how we increase buy-in to the IMF, giving capacity to actually solve the debt crises that go around much of the world. Firstly, let's start with the realistic issues with China. Opening government says that China have a variety of bad incentives. But as opening opposition, as I'm anticipating closing opposition are going to say, these things have changed over time. They've received heavy criticism for bad deals. Everybody knows about the Hambantota port. So they've changed a lot of those things and want to be a bit fairer. However, there are still deep intrinsic problems, regardless of these things, that are still endemic. What are these? Firstly, China is going to offer you higher interest rates where it comes to the loans that they offer you. Why is that? It's because China is currently struggling economically. They face things like the Evergrande crisis, which has undermined faith in their economy, downgraded them on like, for example, Chinese bonds, and then that means that the faith in investing in China is low, so their companies struggle more. That means that they've been turned to new sectors, things like electric vehicle manufacturing and green technology. What's the problem with these? These are being heavily sanctioned right now. The buyers that they want for these things in the West, in North America, and in Canada, the places that have the money to implement things like green grids are the ones who are putting 100% tariffs on them to make sure that Western companies are favored. So all of the money that China sunk into trying to establish these sectors has gone to naught. So that means when they offer it to you, they need the servicing money back, and so they offer you it at a high interest rate. Secondly, when they offer you support, when they offer you to do things like help with with infrastructure projects. They heavily favored themselves over you. Before, it might have been the case that they wanted to employ Sri Lankan contractors, but now China needs cash. They need stimulus on the ground. So that means they employ Chinese contractors. They make sure that there's majority, for example, Chinese-owned firms who are involved in it, that they have maximal ownership. So it hurts these nations much more. It decreases the ability for the money that goes in to be rebuilding these economies in question. Chinese volatility is increasing because of the sanctions that I talked about, which means that the demand for these things will continue to block the ability for these things to get better for these countries. But lastly, China needs that servicing money, the few million a month. So that means that they aren't opting into restructuring processes. They aren't doing what the IMF does, which is when if you can't pay back, you sit down with them and say, let's work on a new deal. They just say, no, pay back as soon as you fucking can, or we're going to make your economy bleed. That means they have less money to help them, so they offer you a higher interest rate. China has less allies right now, so that means that supply shocks will hit them harder. What does that mean? That means that when you, as any country, are more dependent on the Chinese consumer, anytime there's a supply shock in China, anytime there's a famine, anytime the people in China are poorer, there's less consumers to buy your shit, so the volatility of your economy is higher as well. Why is this important? We think that taking more Chinese debt is a problem. Why would you do that right now? Why would you do both? First, because a lot of this debt is non-conditional. A non-conditional loan is easier for you to take. And even if it's not, they can try and play each other off. You can say we can easier IMF loan by playing China and the West off against each other. That's a bad thing. We want the IMF loan to be taken, as we'll explain a little bit later. The problem is, when the fall comes on their side of the house, it will be far deeper. It means that when the crash comes, when there's a supply shock, when there's anything, the ability for you to recover is much, much harder. And I would note, this creates long-term crises, because a lot of monetary crises can easily be solved. If in 2010, Pakistan got a good IMF loan, it means that they probably could have been able to get out of their monetary crisis. But if you go deeper with the snake, it's going to bite more. So that means on our side, there's deeper and more important impacts that are harder for us to reverse. On our side, they don't take those loans. Restoration is good. Now, let's talk about what it is that helps other countries buy into the IMF. The weighing here is the capacity to help. 60% of the world's low-income countries are in debt distress. There's many states like what OG talks about, but if the IMF lacks capacity to help them out, to put the money in, even if their incentive analysis is true, it doesn't work. All of OG on smaller loans and loans going down is reliant on the capacity to offer them in the first place. Why do nations pay in when you block out China? Firstly, the conditions that you have when you're only dependent on the IMF are good. Firstly, it's things like the mutual investment guarantee. It means that with an IMF loan, you also get a guarantee for any companies who are investing into that country from the IMF that they will cover you if there's political changes that hurt them. So a higher proportion of conditional loans means you have more faith. That means more money pours in. Why do these conditions exist? If you like structural reasons, it's because people fear investing in distressed states. They fear losing their money. They convert their currency to that country's money, and they fear it becoming worthless. So that guarantee is good and means more money can pour in, so they're more happy to keep that sort of pinned on. Secondly, they prevent overspending politically because they have conditions for that kind of thing. It's either like, you prevent political overspending or that kind of thing, versus China is much more likely to deviate conditions. They'll have you be irresponsible or a risk of not having those loans paid back. Corrupt conditions and stuff like they have conditions on things like making sure corruption doesn't happen in your state because they need to make sure that investor countries stay within the IMF. They have transparency conditions to see where the money is going. They keep these things in place to make sure that the majority of creditor countries continue to contribute to the IMF because they don't want to lose their money. Why are these things exclusive? Why does it only need to be the IMF bailout? A, you need to make sure it goes to the right places. Who are these states? Opening government asserts they're corrupt. Why are they corrupt? It's places like Argentina, where what the people want is short-term fiscal measures, like healthcare or fuel subsidies to get them through the winter. So the state will always spend that way, as opposed to spending on spending on responsible things. But secondly, a lot of them are autocratic. It's states with military political cooperation who would favor heavy spending for their militaries to be power projecting, as opposed to meeting monetary conditions. So what that means is that there's always a risk that the money would never go to the right place if you were also taking a Chinese one, or you could just take more loans on. Not taking on the additional debt burden means now every single creditor country has so much more faith. There's all these guarantees. There's all this safety. So you know the money will come back and you continue to pour it in. Opening, please.
Pretty much no creditors, from commercial banks to countries, have the power to impose conditionality. If we ban China for not imposing conditionality, what does it say we wouldn't ban other creditors for the same reasons?
No, so when you're the only resort, then it's kind of like my way or the highway, right? You're fucked on that side of the house. So if it's not certain that the money will not go towards padding cronies' pockets, it's uncertain it'll ever come back. Even if there's limited capacity, there's an opportunity cost, right? Does my $100 go 100% into industries or maybe growth, or does it line the pockets of those people? We need to have conditions to have these things on their side of the house. OG says that you need that loan. This affects more axes of the economy. But lastly, it's a priority of creditors. The IMF is low priority because they have the longest term deals. You get a deal now, it's due in 10 10 years, versus the Chinese loan is already at maturity, so the IMF is getting fuck all back. But also, they just have too much of a burden, so minimal servicing is pushed. We already told you why corruption means you take lots and lots of money from China, and there's no punishment from taking too much, because China wants these loans geopolitically. They want allies. They want to buy votes at the UN more than they want that money. And this is the most proximate interest of China. They don't want foreign growth. They can't control foreign governments. They do want geopolitical control. What that means is now, on our side, there's much more faith, much more money in the IMF. Why does that matter? Firstly, long-term changes. There can now be more pressure on the IMF to be able to help these countries into the future, to get companies to have the faith to put money in, to be able to restore industries in these countries, get people working and give people jobs. These are only things that happen when foreign companies are willing to put money in the first place, which only happens when you have a guarantee. That guarantee is destroyed on their side of the house, where China can give it to you unconditionally. The volatility of these deals is also low, but this should be enough to win the debate.
I'd like to give the floor to the member of opposition to open this debate.
Slow. I can be heard. Perfect. Panel ready? Yeah, great. When you take out a loan from the bank and you're unable to pay them back, they repossess your car. And what we're going to argue from closing opposition simply is that China is going to take collateral back from these countries, and that will destabilize them massively. What we're going to argue then, firstly, is just to talk about how these Chinese loans work. And we say that they operate in a similar way to how opening government frames and how other teams talk about in this debate, which is to say that you give large amounts of money out to nations, which they can't necessarily pay back, and as a result, you expect that when countries are at the brink, when they're at the point where they're going to go to the IMF, they may not be able to give you back money through just direct payment from taxation and stuff like this. As a result, then, you need to have collateral. You need to have something that you're going to get back in the case in which everything goes bust. It means having collateral in the place of mines. It means collateral in the place of ports, of airfields, things like this, if these loans fail. What do you do within this structure as China? What do you do when you're giving out these loans? You send in things like the military to assist the building of infrastructure projects. We've seen this empirically in the status quo. The way in which they're able to sell this to countries is it's a means of security to make sure that your infrastructure that you're building doesn't get tampered with, that is able to be built properly, and we've just seen this like empirically. This is the Sri Lankan ports example that's brought up by opening opposition. This is literally what happened. The second thing they do is they just write into legal agreements that ports, airfields, and stuff like this will be used as collateral. And the reason why they want this is because they want China to grow economically. Specifically, they want to get things which they can use into the future, like transportation links, which they can move their goods through. They want things like raw materials, which they can use to build different, maybe if they want zinc, so they can build EVs into the future, and stuff like this. Therefore, China have existing means and capacity to just seize collateral from these countries legally. It doesn't involve the invasions, which I agree with opening opposition. They're not going to come in and, run the army in, but they can just take it because that's just part of the agreement. Why then will China seize them? Firstly, to justify to people that the retaliation is being put back towards the massive fuck you being given to them by the IMF as framed by opening opposition, which is to say that it is quite antagonistic for a largely perceived Western entity to say we're not going to allow you to take out these sorts of debts and stuff like this. As a result, you want propaganda to push back to your people that you are not just sitting down and being bossed around by other countries. The second thing to say is it's just economically beneficial, which is that if you don't take back this collateral, you have a lot of debt that's just never being repaid, and as a result, you're just losing a ton of money, and this is something which is unconscionable given the framing from both government teams, which is also spoken about in DLO, which is that China is not in the best place economically right now. They cannot afford to just allow ports and loans to just go out with no money coming back to them. Third reason is that the legal precedent exists. And notice, you might say that other states might not recognize this legal precedent, and as a result, you might not be able to act upon it. But we would say that there's mutual interest to allow China to do this legally. The reason for this is because other states also have loans that they've lended out, and as a result, they also want to pull back their collateral in the case, no thank you, that fails. Notice then, we would say that this is bad for a number of reasons. The first impact that spans from this is it prevents states from repaying their debts into the future to the IMF or to China. The reason for this is because you cannot have a strong, growing economy if you do not have access to infrastructure within your state, like bridges, like roads, if they're owned by somebody else, if you do not have your mines which you're able to use for natural resources. There are two reasons then why this is particularly economically harmful. The first is you must pay China consistently if you want to, no thank you, access to this, which is to say this is a cost which goes forward into the future, which is going to harm you. The second thing to say is you cannot gain money out of a lot of the imports and exports which are going through these sorts of channels. The reason for this is because China often has exclusivity within their contracts to do things like put their own goods into these sorts of markets, to flood their cheapened goods that come out of Chinese manufacturing into these markets, which crowds out domestic industry in these countries and doesn't allow them to be able to grow. The second reason why this is bad is just guts faith in the government, which is to say that when you're in a crisis, people are scared and frustrated. They want security. They know that the world is maybe falling apart around them to a degree. Maybe their job is not going to exist into the future anymore. As a result, when you have part of your country annexed by a foreign state, taken by them, and you're unable to have access to it, this makes people quite unhappy when they see this in the paper. They have less faith in the government. They're less likely to go out and vote. They're more likely in systems that have weak taxation to pay up to the government because they don't believe they're going to spend it well, and this just further perpetuates instability. I just want to talk about why public trust is important for recovery for these states. There are two reasons. The first is you need political stability for long-term plans, which is to say the parties have to interact with the IMF into the future. If it is the case that your populists are pissed off, then populist parties or other alternative parties tend to come up with massive support. If they get into power, then you break up the link between these parties and the IMF, which means you cannot properly pay this back. The second thing to say is the perception of instability within a state through things like people just being unhappy protesting on the street means that you're less likely to get FDI and funding from other companies, but they do not want to go into a state which is seen as unstable. The third broad reason why this is very bad is you destroy future planning, which is to say that governments have to think ahead and try to project, no thank you, recovery. They need to decide that we're going to pivot towards this industry such that we can repay into the future. The reason for this is because they have to present plans to the IMF in order to be seen as being able to repay, and often the IMF will work through with experts in a structure to try to do this. Therefore, you create a risk at the point to which the plans you've done, like trying to move towards your zinc mining to try to rebuild this industry, just gets taken away in the morning by China, which means that you're not able to do the things which would allow you to repay the IMF, which on the one hand makes the IMF less comfortable in continuing to give this money to you, but also just fucks over your economy going into the future. Before I explain why this scales beyond the immediate term, opening, go.
Yeah. China does not want to get into a head-to-head with the entire IMF structure in order to say they implement things in expropriating. Chinese security guards can stay long at the highway without electricity and basic necessities of the state, and thus expropriation works.
The reason why this isn't true is because they're not going up against the IMF as a collective body. The IMF is made up of many different countries which all have individuated incentives to be able to pull back collateral on their own loans. Your response is contingent on all of them wanting to group together against China, which we just don't think is the case. Why does this scale into the future? Because notice, this motion occurs for like current loans which are outstanding. We also think countries are going to continue to take loans from China going forward instead of the IMF. The reason for this is because there are just lower checks and balances against autocracy within states, which are often run by people who want to hold their grip on power and which do not want to conform to IMF conditions. This scales because unlike the OG preemption, which says that you want to keep going to the IMF because they're a good actor, we think that given that these states already have governments that have allowed them to fail, that would indicate that they possibly don't have the best incentives when it comes to doing their monetary policy. Perhaps they care more about their own skin than they care about that of their people into the future. As a result, given we show that you're unable to hold on to your collateral on the existing Chinese loans and you continue to take them into the future, you gut these countries' ability to recover and you destroy the faith that people have inside of these states. For all of these reasons, closing opposition.
I thank the speaker very much for that very fine speech. I'd like to give over to the government who went to let the government mention today's debate. Here you go.
Will I be heard if I go like this between the papers, or should I? Brilliant. Okay. going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to deal with closing opposition's crazy extension. Second, I'm going to answer the question, what will China do? Will they pull out of the IMF and stop investing, or change their behavior to the better? Lastly, I'm going to talk about economic growth and why this is the unique way in which we can actually ensure debt recovery. Let's first deal with closing opposition. Their first case is that China will just go and seize the collateral, and then it's going to cause a lot of distrust within those countries because they are being annexed part of the country, per the words of member of OP. The first thing I just want to point out in terms of the legality of the matter is that the loan has not failed. The loan has been frozen. That's literally what the info slide says. So when the IMF is paid back, then the country is also going to repay back their loan to China. So there is no legality to it, but also it makes no sense for China to be seizing useless collateral when they can get their money back once the IMF is being repaid. Second, even if China is afraid that they will not be paid back, it won't go and annex part of your country. One, just the practicality of going and doing that is quite difficult. But secondly, as we noted, China is not in the best economic state. It knows that the pushback from the West would be endless if they just went and started seizing a bunch of collateral. So they are far more likely to know that the loan will be paid back post-recovery and wait for that loan to be paid back. So that thing is out. Second, they say that the countries will now go to China exclusively instead. First, I think it was pointed out by their opening even that the IMF is often a last resort, meaning that if the countries could have just gone to China exclusively, they probably would have done that. The reason why they're going to the IMF is because they need the IMF. I'm going to give you structural reasons why it's true, right? We pointed out, lots of people pointed out that China has far less allies than the Western bloc within the IMF. They have less money than the Western bloc within the IMF. And the IMF is much closer to Western international institutions. They have access to media that can, for example, incentivize more investors going in to the countries that are debt distressed. So there is a very, very good reason to go for the IMF. This explains why they will go to the IMF exclusively as opposed to China exclusively. That's it for closing opposition. Second question, what will China do dealing with the opening opposition push? O says that China will pull out of the IMF. We say that there are very good reasons to stay in the IMF, so the likely reaction of China is they will change their behavior in a way that prevents the problems with Chinese loans in the future. That's a quite large impact because it also influences all the future Chinese loans. Funnily enough, opening opposition concedes that China wants to stay in the IMF, because when they are giving their structural reason why China puts a lot of money in the IMF, those are reasons they are giving you for why China wants to stay in the IMF and probably wouldn't be pulling out, right? Reasons such as that China wants to be keeping influence over the conditions, given that they want the countries to recover so they can get paid later. Or all the things that O literally told you and I don't have to be repeating. This then means is that rather than pulling out, China is going to stay and likely is going to change behavior to stop being designed in the way that they are being designed per the motion. So for instance, we might be able to influence China to buy into agreements on loan repayments. So they are more likely to be helping countries restructure their debts, which they currently are not agreeing on. That is a benefit flipping of all. Let's talk about economic growth. No, we explained better why we need to prevent countries from taking extra Chinese debt to help them economically recover. Again, I want to weigh this over opening opposition. Opening opposition says that investors will not want to lend to these developing countries because now it creates a precedent and all countries are going to be really scared that they're going to be designed the words that I can't pronounce as well. The first thing I want to point out is that it's obviously very possible to explain why this is something that is specific to China and what's the reasoning for why China is being designed that way. But secondly, the info slide suggests that this is a policy that the IMF can do. This is presumably known. So it's unclear why this is the tipping point for when it's used in this specific case. Now everyone's going to get really scared and going to stop investing. But lastly, even if somehow it's a tipping point and Brazil and India get really scared, this is bonkers idea that they're going to just stop investing money. Those are countries that are trying to establish themselves as growing economies. They want to be having soft power, market power. Because of that, they are highly unlikely to stop investing. Instead, they're likely to not do the bad stuff China does to make sure that they're not going to get designed as well. Again, that's a benefit independently for us on CG. What will then want investors want to invest? We are flipping on that. The fact that these countries are going to be able to economically recover with a functional bailout. Those are debt-distressed countries. They are struggling to attract investors on either side. We are helping them getting out of that distress. Opening government attempts to make this point. They run the debunked analysis about Chinese debt threats. does a good job pointing that out. The extent of the analysis, China is evil and they want to be seizing your ports and stuff like that. I want to weigh this very quickly, right? We explain not only why past Chinese loans might have been problematic, as much as OD banks it, but the Chinese loans including future ones have persistent structural issues with the Chinese economy. That means that no matter what the past, all of them are going to have these problems. What were these reasons? We explain why inherently you are going to have higher interest rates because of all the things that Vachi tells you, and I don't want to be losing time on repeating it. I trust that you tracked it. The fact that China has an incentive to heavily favor yourself over you. The fact that they are not opting out into restructuring processes, and the inherent volatility of the Chinese economy that is going to persist into the future. What then is the problem with that? Vachi describes that the fact that countries are likely to take these loans alongside of the IMF loans, and the fact that these loans are unconditional, means that these countries are going to be put into more debt and into more crises, which we want to avoid. Before I talk about what happens on our side, I'll take, opening.
When you blacklist China and you bully them into changing their behavior, I think it's far more likely, because they want to be seen as a powerful nation optically, that they fight back rather than working with you. Why do you blacklist instead of just warning or pulling back slightly?
Sure. I mean, I think I would like to be seen optically, but if I don't have the capacity to do that, then I'm probably going to stay in the IMF. I can never explain why they have the capacity to do it. You gave us reasons why they don't want to do it. It's like they're probably just going to shut up and do the stuff that you're telling them. Never explained. What then happens on our side? We explained why it needs to be uniquely IMF loans, not also loans alongside of China. We explained that that we need them to take only the IMF loan to be able to actually adhere to the important and useful conditions that the IMF is giving. And we gave a variety of reasons why, if they have the access to Chinese loans as well, they will not be adhering to the conditions properly and they will not be able to recover. Second, we also explained that we need to prioritize repaying the IMF quickly. And again, we gave reasons why they will not do it and will prioritize repaying the other loans if we don't stop them from taking them. What are the impacts of this? First, we explained far better from opening government, far more structurally, far more without relying on myths, why this is necessary. Secondly, we explained why this increases the faith in the IMF, why we get far more funding in the IMF, again engaging on the opening opposition metric, why more countries are going to be able to get money and get out of debt. For all those reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
Today's debate. Here.
The CO extension wins this debate for 3 reasons. Firstly, because China certainly and irreversibly seizes these properties. And I would note, per the info slide, the IMF orders the debtor countries to stop repaying existing loans. We ask opening government, given they think China is very predatory and BRI was pretty bad, what they think China is going to do now, what they think it currently looks like. And given that they tell us that these were pretty bad and predatory loans that existed, do you not think one of the biggest countries in the world, with the biggest population, that invented a system of loans in order to exert its soft power over other countries, would have a pretty good contract when it's investing trillions and billions of dollars into the infrastructure development of other countries? Like, do governments think these loans fell out of the coconut tree? What the fuck do you think happens when you lend this much money to another country? Obviously you want your return on investment, obviously you want collateral, and obviously you write that into the legally binding document that you bind that country to. This is ridiculous to ignore this, and when they all concede the Sri Lankan investment took place, I think this is very stupid from them. The second thing I would note is that, within this though, even if you don't believe China has like an airtight legal claim to this and a massive incentive to get a return on investment, I would just note they have the capacity to do this. Because as Waji concedes in the first part of their extension, China sends Chinese workers and contractors who are presumably loyal to China to build this infrastructure. So let's say the people who have built the port in Sri Lanka were Chinese, the contractors you used to get supplies were Chinese, and they all signed contracts with the Chinese government. If China tries to exert that they have the capacity to steal this infrastructure back, who the fuck do you think they listen to? Like, even if you don't buy the legality of this, obviously their loyalty, sit down, is to China. So I just think it's ridiculous to claim that there would be no attempt to seize this back anyway. The second thing I would note that I think is quite important here is that they also just have some degree of a massive army. I'll respond to these weird claims about the Chinese economy later. But even if not, the debtor country is in an economic crisis at the point where the IMF is lending money to them. Like, the IMF lends money, as is conceded in the entire debate, to countries that are desperate, to countries that require bailouts and require access to money. How the fuck, sit down, do you think they are going to stop China when they're trying to resolve an economic crisis? Second thing I think is important for us to win this debate is that there's a severe loss of future income for these countries that are currently desperate that happens on their side of the debate when you lose access to these things. I would note the importance of having a port or an airport is you have tariffs you can collect when there's imports or exports coming through them, but also say it is just docking fees in your port for any boat that stays there. It is the cost of train tickets that get to be spent to go to the government that they can spend on other money, or simply like the massive deals you make with planes and airline companies, so they have the ability, no thank you, to use the gates of the airport that you own and have long-standing contracts. They can have different flights going every day at a certain time from their country to yours. All of these are quite important amounts of money. The problem is on their side, China has access to that money, and that is less money going into the government that they could use for government stimulus to either keep themselves out of future crises or spend themselves out of this one. But the third thing to note is I think they massively reduce these countries' capacity to deal with crises on their side. And I would notice, even if the IMF loans, like with the declaring China intransigent, is going to be so successful on GovBench that it helps these countries get out of these economic crises. Crises happen regardless of how great countries are at getting out of the last one. Firstly, no thank you, because black swan events like COVID-19 happen that no one can predict or see coming, and they have catastrophic impacts to the global economy. But secondly, because of global interconnectedness and the fact that supply chains run through many different countries, often a crisis in one state can affect you too. All of this means that the capacity to deal with crises is very important. And I would note that, firstly, you are putting those countries in a position where they lose access to funds they could use to spend or prevent crises. But secondly, because the debt racks up. And again, when Wadji concedes that interest rates from China are pretty fucking high, obviously then if you stop making payments back, you are going to have massively more debt when your IMF loan ends and you still have to repay China at the end of this. Let's engage in with the responses that we got to our case. The second set of responses Lucy gives wasn't the case we ran. We didn't say they were going to go to China. That's just something else. Firstly, they say the legality of this is that it's been frozen. The first thing I would say is that's just a massive assertion. And it's not even likely, right? Because China both wants a return on their investment and has years of experience offering these loans and forming these kinds of contracts and the money to make sure they have the legality and tight claim to this collateral at the end of the day. But secondly, even if it is frozen, I would note neither Gov team ever tells you how long it takes to repay IMF loans. I would posit quite long, because if it is the case that you take an IMF loan when you are desperate, I don't think your economy is in a pretty good position to pay back the IMF loan in the long term in its entirety for quite a long time. So if you're China, right, and you want to have access to some degree of payments over a long period of time, because they all concede that China kind of likes getting money off these countries, but then, they're going to stop paying you, and probably for like 20 years, but it's not even clear how long it's going to be. Would you prefer to take the certain collateral now and just deal with whatever legal battle you have to down the line, and because you know that you're getting money from having this infrastructure now? Or would you prefer to just wait and see when they're going to pay you back, when they're going to stop having the loan be frozen? So beyond the assertion from Lucy that they are frozen, that it says in the info side, but it doesn't, but also that being frozen means that you wouldn't have legal responsibilities in a contract, I just think obviously China's incentive would be to take it anyway and just deal with the problems down the line that happen. Let's engage then with the closing government extension. I think it's really funny. The first thing is that China is going to be is a bit fairer, but says high interest rates, and when they offer support, they heavily prioritize themselves. We agree. These are reasons that they are able to steal the collateral back, but also that you're leaving these countries in massive amounts of debt at the end of the day otherwise, because the interest rates rack up over time. Secondly, they say, well, you don't want to tie yourself to China because the unconditional loans are bad if you're tying yourself to an economy that's bad. How do closing government think that loans work, right? Because what they say is you'll fall deeper if you're tied to a country that's bad. But loans are either you get a lump sum at a given amount of time that you have to repay, or you get the investment in infrastructure that happens that China has historically done through the BRI. Either way, that is an immediate amount of money that you have to pay back. I'm not sure what this falling deeper actually means for closing government. Weird thing for them to say. Before I go on, sure, opening.
So you think that once the army and police of those countries will try to stop China from stealing its property, China will enter a near-army military conflict and risk everything like their trade and other...
No. I just think that they have... No, Annie, stop. I think they just have a legal contract saying that if you fail to repay their loan, they can take it as collateral. It's empirically happened with Sri Lanka. They also have a massive incentive to do it, and I'm not sure these countries have the capacity to stop it. But thirdly, they say that conditions are good because it gives IMF lenders faith that they can get their money back. Like, panel, they already have conditions. What? The IMF does have conditions on its loans right now. Why is this the tipping point for either GovBench team to have confidence in the IMF when the status quo is that they haven't declared China intransigent and that still money is paid into the IMF? I'm very unclear as to why there's going to be a massive loss of money as a result of nothing changing for either GovBench team. For opening government, the first thing to respond to is they say the IMF is going to have, yes, the thing I've just said about the IMF having less money. I'm unsure about this. Secondly, they say China won't seize the ports or infrastructure because China is broke. Firstly, it's quite obvious that governments still spend money in different things in their economy, right? They say China has a housing crisis. China has various different problems. Why does that mean China's military or China's interest in other loans would be decreased? Like, they have other bits of their budget to which they devote different amounts of money. But secondly, they're an authoritarian regime. It's not expensive to do this, but also they have massive ability to do population control. Notice the COVID lockdowns, people died in their apartment blocks because China had the capacity to stop them from leaving. So I'm really unsure why that is something that's going to harm their capacity to do these things. I just think this is the most realistic case in the debate, despite other teams calling it crazy and being pretty fucking rude. Oppose.